She was rich, powerful, and one of the most feared women in Europe. She lived in a castle of silence, surrounded by the innocent ... And by death, they say she bathed in blood to stay young. They say hundreds of girls entered her gates but never came out. Some called her a monster. Others said she was framed by the jealous men who feared her. But somewhere between legend and truth lies the story of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess. A story soaked in fear, obsession, and a thirst that would never be quenched. If you like sinking into the darker corners of forgotten history, where myth and horror quietly hold hands, consider subscribing. This story is just getting started, and this will be a journey in 3 parts. The year was 1560. The forests of Hungary were thick, dark, and filled with whispers. Somewhere in the northern Carpathians stood a castle. It wasn't the kind that sat gracefully on a hilltop. No, this one loomed like it had grown out of the earth itself. Inside that stone fortress, Elizabeth Bathory was born, not just into nobility, but into something darker. Her family was one of the most powerful in Eastern Europe, rich in gold, land, and blood. Very early on, she was surrounded by things most children would never see: public executions, disease, strange rituals, and perhaps worst of all, cruelty disguised as nobility. It said that Elizabeth, even as a child, was highly intelligent. She could speak 4 languages before the age of 10. She was proud, calculating, and always watching. But what she watched may have twisted something inside her. Some historians whisper that she saw a man sewn alive into the belly of a dying horse, a punishment, they say, for theft. Others say she watched her own servants beaten for mistakes so small they were barely real. Pain, punishment, and power became early companions. By the age of 14, she was engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier known as the Black Knight of Hungary. Their marriage wasn't one of love. It was a political merger of 2 colossal families. Ferenc was rarely home. He was out fighting the Ottoman Empire, earning a reputation as one of the cruelest warriors of his age. He was adored for his brutality. It is said that when he returned, he taught Elizabeth things: how to discipline disobedient servants, how to punish with precision, how pain could be controlled like a blade. And while he was away, Elizabeth was left in control of vast estates, hundreds of servants, and dozens of young village girls brought in for labor. That's when it began. The disappearances were quiet at first. A girl would vanish, the family was told she ran away or was sent to another castle. But whispers began to stir in the surrounding villages that the Countess was not just strict, but cruel beyond reason. That she struck girls in the face with hot irons, that she bit them like an animal. That some girls were found buried in shallow graves with their limbs twisted unnaturally, their mouths frozen open, as if they had died mid-scream. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth was only 44, still young, still powerful, but now fully alone, and something changed. Without the dark anger of her husband, her appetite for control and for punishment deepened. She moved to Lactus Castle, a remote place surrounded by woods and whispers. It was here, they say, the blood truly began to flow. Girls were brought in from surrounding villages with promises of work, safety, food. Most of them poor, teenage, and utterly unaware of what lay ahead. They were stripped, beaten, starved. And then ... they vanished. Elizabeth was obsessed with beauty. She covered mirrors in her castle, terrified of the lines appearing on her face. One legend says that after striking a maid so hard her blood landed on Elizabeth's hand, she noticed her skin looked smoother where the blood had touched. Something sparked, and from then on, the rituals began. Was it real? Did she truly bathe in their blood, or was that just a myth? A tale spun by frightened villagers or ambitious men who wanted her land. The records are confusing, but what's undeniable is the sheer number of witnesses. Over 300 people testified during her eventual trial. Servants spoke of rooms painted in blood, torture chambers, frozen bodies stacked in the winter snow, waiting to be buried. One maid said the Countess would place girls into cages with spikes, then raise the cages to the ceiling and spin them, letting the blood fall below like some terrible fountain. She described girls being sewn shut, their mouths stitched to silence their screams. But even amidst all this horror, Elizabeth was protected. For years, no one dared touch her. She was connected to the king. Her family was ancient. She wrote letters to powerful people, conducted state affairs, and presented herself as the refined, noble woman. Behind the locked doors of her castle, though, something monstrous may have been growing. The breaking point came when she got greedy. She began to run out of peasant girls, and so she started taking noble girls, daughters of minor aristocrats, students from the gentry. And that's when the silence shattered. The court could no longer ignore the deaths. Nobles were now weeping at their gates. Elizabeth's name, once spoken with respect, now passed from lip to lip like a curse. In December 1610, Count Georgi Thurzo was sent to investigate. When he arrived at her castle, what he found was not a woman grieving or defensive. He found death. Fresh corpses, half-naked and mutilated, girls chained to walls. A smell that lingered in the stone like a wound that would never heal. Elizabeth didn't resist. She was placed under house arrest, not executed because of her noble blood. But she was sealed inside her room, the door bricked up with only a small slot for food. She would never leave that room again, and yet, the story doesn't end there. Because even today, many wonder if Elizabeth Bathory was truly guilty, or if she was the victim of a massive political betrayal. Was she a sadistic killer, or a brilliant, powerful woman brought down by the men who couldn't control her? That's what we'll explore next, part 2. We'll take you deeper into the blood, the truth, and the darkness history tried to bury. To make sure you don't miss it, consider subscribing, and remember, history isn't always what's written. Sometimes it's what they tried to erase. They sealed her inside the room, brick by brick, stone by stone, as if they were trying not just to contain her body, but to trap the horror. No trial, no public confession, just silence. For the most powerful woman in Hungary, this was her verdict, a coffin made of walls, passed over by time like a shadow in the castle. And yet the question lingers, heavy and unanswered. Was Elizabeth Bathory truly guilty of the horrors they whispered? Or was she just the perfect scapegoat? You see, something doesn't quite add up. Elizabeth wasn't a stranger to the royal court. She was a Bathory connected by blood to kings and bishops. Her cousin was the Prime Minister of Hungary. Another relative was a cardinal, and her land worth a fortune. Her husband's death had left her the sole heir to a massive estate. Castles, gold, influence, power, and in the early 1600s, a woman with that much power was dangerous, especially to men who wanted it for themselves. The man who ultimately led her arrest, Count Georgi Thurzo, was not just a loyal servant of the crown. He was also someone who stood to gain if Elizabeth fell. After all, her properties needed to go somewhere, and once she was locked away, the crown quietly absorbed much of what she had once ruled. The very people who had once toasted her at banquets now spoke of her as a witch, a mad woman, a blood-drenched monster. But how convenient that these rumors only exploded after her protection faded. And what about the testimonies? Over 300 people spoke against her, yes. But how many saw the crimes with their own eyes? Less than a dozen. Most claimed they had heard about the tortures, or heard the screams, or had heard from someone else. In a time when fear and superstition ruled the countryside, and torture was a common tool for extracting answers, how reliable were those voices? One story claimed that a servant girl escaped the castle barefoot and bleeding, and ran for hours to reach the nearest village. That her fingers were broken, her hair cut off, her eyes wide with something she couldn't put into words. Another spoke of a secret tunnel beneath the castle where bodies were thrown like trash. And yet, no such tunnel was ever found, no mass grave uncovered. No Iron Maiden or blood chamber documented in the official records. In fact, no one ever saw Elizabeth commit a single act herself. Most of the violence was described by her servants, some of whom were promised clemency in exchange for their testimony. some of whom were later executed anyway, burned alive while the crowd jeered. They said the crimes were unspeakable, but they spoke of them anyway, over and over again. And then there's the legend of the blood bath, the part of the story that made Elizabeth immortal, bathing in the blood of virgins to retain youth, a fantasy so grotesque and so perfect, it spread like fire through Europe. But in truth, this detail didn't appear until years after her death. The idea of blood as cosmetic horror may have been a creation of later writers who took her name and shaped it into a gothic nightmare. Because horror sells, and women, especially powerful ones, have often been turned into monsters, history is filled with such women. Catherine de' Medici, accused of poisoning rivals with perfume. Empress Wu, said to have killed her own children to take power. Cleopatra, branded as a seductress above all else. In reality, they were strategists, survivors, rulers in a world that didn't want them. Elizabeth may have been cruel, she may have beaten servants, she may have ruled with fear. But did she really kill hundreds? Did she truly bathe in blood? Or was she simply the easiest woman to hate? After her imprisonment, the castle slowly decayed. Servants left, walls crumbled, her name became a ghost. In 1614, after 4 years sealed in darkness, a guard looked through the slot and found her body cold, curled against the wall. They buried her in secret, fearing that even her grave might become a source of fear or fascination, and it did. Her name was erased from family records. Her tomb was hidden, some say it was destroyed. Others say she was never buried at all. But the myth only grew stronger. Over the centuries, poets, painters, and storytellers reached for her name like it was a candle burning in the dark. They called her the female Dracula. They painted her with crimson lips and blood-stained hands. And slowly, the real woman, the countess who lived in fear, power, and silence, was lost beneath a mask made of legend. Even Bram Stoker, who would later create Dracula, was likely inspired by the stories of Elizabeth, a woman who drank the youth of others, who lived in a shadowed castle, who terrified the innocent and attracted the curious. Some say she is the origin of the vampire queen. That without her, horror fiction might have taken a different shape entirely. But here's what remains beneath the myth: a woman born into power, raised on cruelty, and buried in mystery. Maybe she was a killer, maybe she was a victim. Maybe she was both, and maybe that's what truly terrifies us. That the line between monster and human is thinner than we think, but we're still not done. Because there's one more part of this story no one talks about: the forgotten rituals, the secret diaries, the modern science that's starting to sound a little too familiar, and the truth about how far people, even today, are willing to go to keep themselves young. That is what we'll uncover in Part 3. If you've come this far, and you still feel that chill crawling up your spine, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay close. The story isn't over. It never really was. They said she died alone, her name blackened, her legacy buried. They thought the story ended behind the walls where she took her last breath. But legends like hers never really die. They wait, they shift. They change their skin and crawl quietly into new bodies, new rituals, new desires. What Elizabeth Bathory was accused of, bathing in blood to stay young, sounds like horror, a gothic fantasy, something meant only for old books and old nightmares. But what if it wasn't so far from truth? What if it never really stopped? For centuries later, in the sleek glass towers of the modern world, something eerily similar has returned, only now it wears a lab coat. They call it rejuvenation, anti-aging, youth science. But listen closely and you'll hear the echo of her footsteps in every whispered promise. 100 spas across the world now offer what they call vampire facials, procedures where your own blood is drawn, processed, and injected back into your face to tighten the skin, to make it glow, to make you young again. It's medical, it's clean, it's modern, but the idea is ancient. There are billionaires funding young blood transfusion experiments, where the blood plasma of teenagers is infused into older adults to improve memory, energy, even longevity. Scientists argue it's about proteins and circulation, but deep beneath the data, it's the same hunger, the same fear, the same obsession with not fading, not aging, not dying. We may no longer bathe in blood, but we inject it, we study it, we pay for it. And like Elizabeth, we don't always question where it comes from. The truth is, she wasn't the only one. All across history, the desperate rich have chased eternal youth through rituals both sacred and savage. Chinese empresses drank mercury, elixirs, Egyptian queens wore gold masks and crushed beetles. Medieval nobles smeared bird droppings and arsenic on their skin, and in quiet, candlelit chambers, they whispered spells to stop the ticking clock. Elizabeth just took it one step further. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she only got caught, because think of what's more terrifying: a lone countess in a forgotten castle, or an entire civilization still clinging to the same madness. Centuries later, we look at her and say, monster, but are we really so different? We spend fortunes to erase lines from our faces, to tighten the skin on our necks, to hide the decades behind creams and needles and lies. We worship youth like a god and treat aging like a disease. Elizabeth didn't invent vanity. She just embodied it in its most extreme, most terrifying form. And what about the stories she left behind? There are still locals near Lactis Castle who swear they hear screams at night, that the air around the old walls turns cold even in summer. Some say her spirit lingers not out of guilt, but out of rage, that she was innocent, and that the world wrote her name in blood only to erase their own sins. Her letters, still preserved in archives, show a woman concerned with money, with order, with her family's future. Not a single line speaks of violence. There are no journals, no confessions, no final words, only silence, and maybe that's why she haunts us. Because in that silence, we place our own fears. Our fear of age, of power, of women who don't shrink, of beauty that demands too much, of pain turned into a mirror. What makes Elizabeth's story last is not just the horror, it's the reflection. She wasn't just the blood countess, she was a question. How far would you go to stay young? Would you lie? Would you take? Would you hurt? Would you bleed? Or would you, like so many do today, look away, pretend it's different, and call it self-care? The truth is, we still live in her castle. It just looks prettier now, and maybe the blood is hidden, but it's still there. Waiting, flowing, feeding the same fear. And if you followed this story all the way to its final breath, thank you. You've walked the halls of silence, looked through the cracks in history, and stared into a mirror most people avoid. If this journey made you feel something, fear, wonder, disgust, or maybe just a chill that won't quite leave, then consider staying. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this. More forgotten whispers, more truths no one wants to say out loud. But here, we say them one dark tale at a time.